Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. As always, so much to discuss, so little time. So before I get into the information I want to cover today, I want to do a couple of quick plugs. Of course, as always, my Patreon. Really appreciate those of you supporting me there. And let me do another plug here very quickly. I would urge people to go and get a copy of the Best of Counterpunch 2021, the Best of Counterpunch Plus. That is the release from Counterpunch that collects some of the best writing that appeared exclusively in Counterpunch over the course of last year. A lot of really great contributors to that, including some of my personal favorites, of course, edited by the great Jeff Sinclair and Joshua Frank over at Counterpunch. Go over to counterpunch.org, go to the Counterpunch Plus section and get the Best of Counterpunch Plus 2021. It's only $12, and you get a lot of really excellent writing, including some of my friends, some of my former guests on the podcast, Sameda Pal, Dan Glazebrook, many others who have appeared with me. If you like what you've heard from me and some of the reporting that you can find on Counterpunch, then this is a great pickup. Again, $12. There's not a lot of things in this world these days that we can get that's worthwhile for $12, and this is one of them. So again, Best of Counterpunch Plus 2021. Go over to counterpunch.org, get yourself a copy of that. And as always, I appreciate those of you who support independent media, independent journalism, especially at a time like this when so much of the media is just garbage. And you have to pick through and wade through so much muck and mire to get to anything of substance. So hopefully that's what you're finding here, and you appreciate that because I know I do when I find it. All right, let's talk about some important information today. I have a bunch of info that I want to cover in a relatively short amount of time. Let's start in Ukraine with Mariupol. Mariupol, of course, is the site of the protracted Russian siege and some of the more heinous crimes that have been committed in this ghastly war. Again, I think that we should just keep in mind that Russia invaded Ukraine, and no matter what disinformation you might want to come across, we have to keep in mind the invader is Russia. They invaded Ukraine, and Mariupol is the site of innumerable crimes. So let's talk about what we find in Mariupol. According to Maxim Tucker, who is on the ground in Mariupol reporting for the Times of London, he is reporting that one of his colleagues, a Mariupol based journalist, reported figures from the city morgue of 113,750 residents dead from the Russian invasion, from the moment of the Russians attacking Mariupol up until, I guess, the most recent figures. Now, according to another journalist, roughly 28,000 also remain unidentified, and supposedly that number probably includes some of those who were killed fighting in Mariupol, perhaps on both sides. So we have to be a little bit cautious when it comes to these numbers. So I figure we take these numbers with an incredibly large grain of salt, and let's say that we could just be conservative and say that it is greatly exaggerated by, doubling the actual number. So let's say the number is 50% lower than what they're reporting. That would put the death toll at roughly 57,000. Okay, now 57,000 is a very large number, but let's put it into context here. 57,000 dead in a city with a pre war population of roughly 500,000 or so. So, roughly 1 in 10 killed. Now, for those, especially for my American viewers, I want to just put into context what Mariupol is in terms of population. Mariupol, pre invasion, was in population roughly equivalent to the cities of Long Beach, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Kansas City, Missouri, Fresno, California, Sacramento, California, Tucson, Arizona, Virginia Beach, Virginia. These are cities that are roughly comparable in population, in the range of 475 to 550,000, give or take. Okay, that is roughly the size of Mariupol. Now imagine just Long Beach, California, or Atlanta, Georgia, and taking 57,000 people from that city and wiping them out. This is the scale of the destruction in Mariupol. This is an astronomically sized war crime. This is a crime against humanity of epic proportions. A death count of even 57,000, assuming that the actual number that was reported is twice as big as reality. 57,000 people killed. Can you imagine? Can you close your eyes and imagine what 57,000 dead people in one city might look like? I say that, and I say that in this way because I find every day, every week, every month that passes of this war in Ukraine, Russia's criminal war in Ukraine, and I say that to stress the fact that an anti-war politics understands and doesn't get lost in the in missing the forest for the trees here. An anti-war politics recognizes that war is a crime, that those who perpetrate wars are criminals, are war criminals. And we don't waver from that understanding just because of some geopolitical calculation we make that Russia is actually at war with NATO. Russia is killing Ukrainians. That is what they are doing. 57,000 in one city of only 500,000 total population. Okay? Empathy, having some anti-war principles, being able to close your eyes and imagine what 57,000 dead people looks like. How many of them are children? How many of them are pregnant women? How many of them died having a bomb dropped on their home? Just imagine the scale of destruction and death, okay? And pull yourself away from those who want to make everything into some geopolitical calculation and forget the fact that these are human beings who are being absolutely massacred by a criminal invading army. All right. I say, I'm just going to say again, empathy. Remember that those people who can't show empathy here are not authentic anti-war voices at all. They are actually pro-war. They're just picking certain sides. All right. Speaking of picking sides, very interesting how much the corruption and mismanagement in Ukraine has also bubbled up to the surface recently. Although this particular issue is not so much about corruption, it does raise questions about fundamental institutions in Ukraine and about their viability moving forward. And in this case, I'm talking about the Ukrainian state run natural gas company that is Naftogaz. Naftogaz, which actually is, I don't know, probably maybe the single biggest component of the overall state budget in Ukraine. Naftogaz in 2021 accounted for 17% of the entire state budget in Ukraine. So this is not just an energy company. This is a massive chunk of the overall economy in Ukraine. So, Naftogaz, which is the state supplier of natural gas, Naftogaz CEO Yuri Vitrenko is on the hot seat. He's on the hot seat, and he's actually come out and said publicly that he'd be willing to step down in order to facilitate what he has argued is the absolutely necessary debt restructuring. The company is now in default, and it is in default because it is unable to pay on the 2022 bonds that have come due. It has been unable to restructure those bonds because the bondholders are simply refusing. Last month, the Zelensky government even came out openly criticizing Naftogaz and the handling of this request for debt restructuring. And this is interesting because this shows you sort of the interplay between the political leadership in Kiev and some of the more central economic players. So the government criticized the company for the request to restructure the debt primarily because the government itself was going to make a request on a much larger restructuring of its own bonds, right? And so the question of was there a lack of coordination between Naftogaz and the Zelensky government? Was this that they are fundamentally disagreeing about how to go about getting out of this economically precarious situation? So it remains to be seen. The request was to freeze debt payments. The request was also to restructure according to the payments that are coming due in 2024. That was also rejected. And the CEO Vitrenko said pretty, bluntly that, it makes sense that they rejected it simply because the 2022 bonds are trading at a much higher rate than are the 2024 bonds. In other words, you can make more money on the bonds that are due this year. So I think we understand investors are interested in money. Investors are not interested in humanitarian concerns. So the Ukrainian government has stepped in with their own request for restructuring. And the company, Naftogaz, has basically said that they are not the ones who want the restructuring. It is the government, and it is the government that is essentially forcing this restructuring. So the Ukraine government wanted the restructuring. Um, and they got worried that the request by Naftogaz to restructure was going to jeopardize their own request for restructuring. So the bondholders are simply rejecting these requests. The company is now in default. And the question is, what next? How does the Ukrainian government continue to, well, pay to service the debt, that is to say, pay on the bonds, while simultaneously being sure not to allow the company to basically collapse, because the company, aside from everything else, aside from all the financials, has to deliver gas. And they definitely have to deliver it as the weather starts to turn colder again. So there is a big problem in Ukraine right now, a big problem when it comes to the gas supplier. And obviously, I mean, I don't have to explain that Russia is turning off the gas spigots in myriad places. Okay, so the question of what the coming fall and winter are going to look like is also reigning quite large in the in the public discourse in Ukraine, and also, of course, in Germany and in other parts of Europe. Got to pay attention to the financial side of this, because the financial side of this could ultimately potentially collapse this central component of the Ukrainian economy. All right. As I'm running out of time, I want to just quickly talk about some of the weapons that the United States has supplied to Ukraine. Again, this contentious issue about whether or not supporting U.S. weapon shipments to Ukraine or rejecting them, I think that's a more philosophical discussion. I think it's important to understand what actually has been delivered, what has been promised to be delivered, and what it means for the future of the war. So the most recent package of $3 billion that was announced by Biden is actually part of the larger 13.7 billion as part of the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. So that includes this 3 billion, I guess, tranche, we could call it. This 3 billion includes at least 6 of the NASAMS, NASAMS. That stands for the National Advanced Surface to Air Missile System. That is designed by a Norwegian company in collaboration with Raytheon. So all of the glorious and wonderful people over at the weapons manufacturers of the U.S. military industrial complex, who peddle these weapons all over the world and make billions of dollars trading in weapons of death. That's what we're talking about here. Of course, we're talking about a war, and we're talking about advanced weapons. It's very, very ugly for those of us who oppose war. So 6 of these advanced surface to air missile systems, in addition to the 2 that have already been donated, that would give the Ukrainians 8 of these particular systems, and that is in addition to the 4 Iris-T air defense batteries that they've received from Germany. So taken together, 4 from Germany, 8 from the United States. That makes it roughly a dozen that are networkable. So that means that Kiev will have a dozen networkable modern air defense batteries. That is going to make it much, much more difficult for the Russians to be able to carry out their bombing runs, to be able to lob rockets and missiles wantonly wherever they feel like. So this is going to make it much more difficult for the Russians to carry out these strikes. This more modern air defense system is way more advanced than what the Ukrainians have been using, which is primarily Soviet era air defense systems, including the early version of what we now would call, I guess, the S-300s. In addition to that, the Ukrainians are also getting a bunch of other systems. One of them, a counter drone system called Vampire, which is basically a rocket launcher that can be loaded onto either military vehicles or onto pickup trucks. This I guess, rocket launching system, can take down drones. It can take down aircraft. It can even be used against ground targets. 70 millimeter laser guided precision rockets to be launched from this thing. And I'm not going to get into all of the different weapon systems. That's not really my thing. That's not my area of expertise. But I will say that there are plenty of other weapon systems that they're receiving as well. Now, an interesting tidbit that comes out of looking at some of these military developments is noticing that the Ukrainians were getting absolutely pounded by the Russian artillery for weeks and weeks and weeks until the United States sent these HIMARS systems, the HIMARS systems. And that has quite successfully reduced Russia's ability to shell Ukrainian cities. And it's very interesting to look at the numbers because before those systems were delivered, well, rather, I guess I should say, after those systems were delivered, the Russians have reduced their shelling by about 2/3. In other words, they're only using about 1/3 the number of shells that they were using. And part of that is because the HIMARS systems that Ukraine got were able to strike at Russian ammo dumps, at Russian factories and warehouses that were housing much of the ammunition. They were able to target logistics and so forth. So they've basically those weapon systems have made it much more difficult for the Russians to be able to even supply the necessary shells. So, consequently, the Russians have significantly scaled back how much they actually are shelling Ukrainian cities. Of course, also the United States is sending massive amounts of small arms ammunition. So, again, more bullets, more shells, more guns, and more death. Of course, that's what the United States deals in. So that's where it stands now. I think we should be mindful of the fact that this war isn't ending anytime soon. And the more we talk about weapons flowing into Ukraine, the more we talk about Russia's crimes against humanity going on and on and on, the more we begin to realize that not only is our agitation for ending the war somewhat irrelevant, it is the facts on the ground that are going to dictate if or when there's any kind of a negotiation. Latest count that I saw had something like 75 to 80% of Ukrainians outright against any form of negotiation with the Russians, and I think the number was even higher if you include the question of ceding territory, Ukrainian territory, to the Russians. So it's going to be particularly difficult, even if the Ukrainian government, for whatever reason, does want to try to sit down and make a deal with Putin and the Kremlin. It's going to be very difficult for them to sell it to the people of Ukraine. And ultimately, the people of Ukraine are the ones that are going to have to support any resolution to this conflict. I mean, the Putin cheerleading side, they want to talk about Zelensky like he's, some kind of fascist dictator or something like this, which is nonsense. I mean, he's a politician. He's an elected politician who absolutely will be removed by force by elements to his right if he is seen as selling out Ukraine to the Russians by signing some kind of deal. So there are domestic political pressures that are going to make it very difficult, even if Zelensky wants to make a deal, for him to be able to do so. So again, it's important for us to pay attention what's happening on the battlefield, because ultimately those are likely the conditions that are going to influence how we get out of all of this. And getting out of all of this is really the goal. It is about defense of Ukraine, defense of people's homes, their neighborhoods, their towns, their families, etc. But more broadly, it's also about avoiding a larger war. It's about avoiding world war. It's about a lot of different things. And that is the nature of the complexity of the issue. And that is why when we speak up in defense of Ukraine and against a criminal war, we do so with the idea that we want the war to end. Not simply defending Ukraine, but we do want the war to end. It's both of those things, and it can be and it must be. That's all I have for today. Talk to you all again next time.